Welcome back to the sixth episode of Rough Draft, the podcast about young journalists brought to you by young journalists. Can't believe it really took me since April to get to the sixth episode of this show. I'm Jamie McCarn, and today I'm joined by Jack Kennedy, a freelance journalist and editor of Trinity News. How's it going, Jack?
I'm not too bad, thanks. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. Good to hear. So I'm going to jump right into the very interesting situation, very interesting turn of events that caused me to get you on the show as quickly as I possibly could. So we'll get to the reason why in a second, but could you first tell us a little bit about the commercial relationship that Trinity News had with the Irish Times before it was recently ended?
Yeah, so for the last 9 years or so, I think it was 2012. Prior to that, we were printed by The Guardian in Manchester, I think. We have had Trinity News. Trinity News has had the Irish Times as our printing partner, so they would print all the physical copies of our newspaper, and we would pay them for that, partially just in cash, but also then in exchange for a slight reduction in our printing costs, we would run advertisements for the Irish Times, usually in our print edition, though to a certain extent on our website too.
And I feel like there's probably quite a big overlap between listeners of this show and people that follow you on Twitter. But just for anyone else that hasn't seen your sort of tweets regarding the situation, would you mind telling me about the decision to end that commercial partnership recently?
No, I'd say you're right. The Irish young journalists and student journalist scene is quite small, but so we made the decision in the last couple of weeks. We announced on Friday the decision to end that commercial relationship. It was inspired by the kind of the broad editorial trend that's been going on in the Irish Times lately, but exemplified in particular by the publication. I think earlier that week, if I might have it wrong, of an article in the Irish Times opposing the proposed ban on conversion therapy on the grounds that these therapists who wrote the article say that it's because they need to conduct gender-related interventions in therapy with young people. So the problem we had with that and with the broader trend that we saw was it was written by a bunch of people who are associated with sort of online trans-exclusionary radical feminist turf groups, like supporters of people like Graham Linehan and J.K. Rowling, who were, effectively advocating the use of conversion therapy in the way that the advocates of this bill describe it. Like they're saying, oh, we don't want to do conversion therapy. We just want to make these like interventions with young people who are questioning their gender. But if you listen to the Anti-Conversion Therapy Coalition, that lobby group who've been the sort of most vocal proponents of this ban are talking about it, like that is what the bill is intended to ban, because these kind of like clinical settings where things can be framed as not being conversion therapy are the sort of circumstances that are most dangerous to young trans or gender non-conforming people. So that was the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, but it was part of a broader trend of the Irish Times like consistently publishing lots and lots of letters with like transphobic content, ranging from like the relatively soft to like, oh, I'm just a bit worried that all this trans stuff has gone too far, to like avowedly very hateful, bigoted stuff in their letters. The kind of thing that, like, the way I put it in one of my tweets when we were making this announcement was like the kind of stuff that like you wouldn't accept in the Facebook comment section of your publication that they were printing in the biggest newspaper in the country. So like it was partially that like there are like editorial standards that we feel in newspapers should adhere to, that like I don't think anyone sincerely believes that the newspapers have an obligation to print every single view, no matter how hateful it is. But it's actually more than that. It's the fact that they were consistently I don't know about seeking out, but certainly like accepting for publication these fringe hateful opinions, and publishing very few and almost no voices in the opposite direction, which, like, aside from being bad for moral reasons, which just isn't reflective of the reality, right? Like transphobia is a big problem, and soft transphobia continues to be a big problem. But like this hardline anti-trans stance isn't what the Irish population is broadly like. It's not that they were receiving 90% letters of this tone on this issue. It's just not plausible. They were deliberately publishing a very consistent line on this. It's reflective of an editorial attitude, and the sort of the thinking as it went for us in TN was that that's not an editorial attitude that we're willing to be associated with anymore. The decision was made by the senior editorial staff in TN. I initially had the idea. I'd been sort of reading this piece and reflecting on sort of the trends that it represented. So I brought it up with the editorial staff because it occurred to me like, hey, we have quite a lucrative financial relationship with them. Like they earn thousands and thousands of euro from us every year. Is this something we're super comfortable with? Is this something that we feel is the right thing for us to continue to support? We talked about it. We decided that this was something we would rather get away from if we could. That we didn't really want to be associated with this anymore. Partially for moral reasons, but also just from like I think a safeguarding perspective. That like I think we as a newspaper that serves a student population have a certain amount of a duty of care in the same way that we wouldn't publish those kind of hateful views in our own pages, because that would be it's abrogating that duty of care to like trans and gender non-conforming students within Trinity. We shouldn't be hosting advertisements for a newspaper where if you click through these advertisements or if you follow these advertisements and go read that newspaper, you're going to be reading them. Like it's by proxy pretty much the same thing. There's just sort of an extra link in the chain. So yeah, we decided that this was a commercial relationship we'd like to get out of. We looked into it to see if we could find another printer. We pretty quickly found one who gave us a quote that actually ended up being ever so slightly cheaper than the Irish Times. Like even when the discount we got from their advertising was included. So once we were sure this is something we could do, like I don't know what would have happened necessarily if we hadn't been able to find another printer, or we had found a printer but it was like significantly more expensive. Like I think at that point the conversation would have become much more difficult, and I certainly would want us to at least consider still like trying to find a creative way out of it or something like that. But we didn't have to cross that bridge. So yeah, we found another printer. We formalized an agreement with them, and once we were kind of sure we had all our loose ends tied up, we notified the Irish Times that we were severing our relationship and explained to them the reasons why. Toyed around with the idea of writing a short editorial about it to explain what it was we were doing. Ultimately went back on that decision just because, I mean, it didn't end up working out because the tweets went sort of mildly viral, and at least in Ireland. The idea was, I suppose, to as I said in one of the tweets, to strike a balance between making the public statement that this is something we weren't associating ourselves with, to sort of, I suppose, increase public pressure in the Irish Times to stop platforming this kind of hatred, but also not wanting to, I guess, make too much of a big deal of ourselves or to seem too self-congratulatory. But that didn't end up working out particularly well. But that was our motivation for announcing it. So yeah, and that's sort of the news today. Yeah, it went a little bit viral. It kind of the tweet got a couple of thousand likes. We had like a pretty overwhelmingly positive response. There was negative feedback on social media, but not that much. None of it seemed to be coming from people within Trinity either, which is obviously the sort of the population that we are, I suppose, most bound to listening to the opinions of. It seemed to be most of the people who were sort of hardcore members of the online turf community. So we didn't take that to heart too much. We got expressions of support from some relatively public figures as well, which was nice.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm so glad that things worked out pretty well, like in general. And I agree with your viewpoint completely. Like I noticed the Twitter, there was like, a minor bit of backlash. I thought it was funny the way people were saying, like, they're trying to frame the situation as, oh, well, the Irish Times, they're just given this opinion. They're just given this sort of opposite opinion to, the trans rights movements. But like every, journalist knows that the whole idea of balance, generally is a good thing. But, you're taught that there are very important instances where, you kind of set that idea of balance to the wayside, like
Yeah.
climate change, for example. If you're talking about scientific fact, like the consensus, there's no point in, platforming someone that's
Yeah.
their views serve no purpose. And the exact same thing in terms of, the rights of people in society to exist. Like there's, I think you probably agree, there's not really
Yeah.
a two sides to the matter.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like that, I think and it's also like I said, it's sort of it's the degree of the tilt. Like I think if they had been occasionally publishing like one or two transphobic things, like, that would be very bad, and we'd certainly have to have, I suppose, an internal conversation about like what we wanted to do with being associated with that. Because like you say, like there are some things that when it comes to people's rights or important issues like climate change, that you don't give voice to those fringe hateful opinions because, like I was saying earlier, like no one actually believes that. Like no one thinks we should be platforming neo-Nazis. We all agree there's a line at which we no longer platform certain views. So it's just a debate about where we think that line is.
I thought it was funny that somebody in your Twitter mentions was saying that the Irish Times is one of the most left-wing newspapers in the country, which is strange. But I've noticed, I've noticed like a kind of a unusual internal sort of culture at the Irish Times. Like almost every month, I see an article from them that's like, "Is Ireland too Anglophobic?" or "We need to stop making fun of the British royal family." And it's strange that they have this big issue with, a semi-fictional Anglophobia problem, but when it comes to, transphobia and like attacks on like the most sort of marginalized people in society, they think that's, they'll tolerate that in their publication, but not the
Yeah,
opposite.
it is. It is. Yeah, it's funny stuff. And I think I saw some meme about this that yeah, the Irish Times, like we can't be supporting Anglophobia but transphobia. It's fine. Yeah, it is. It's a funny one. I mean, I perhaps think it comes from we forget the fact that the it's decades ago now, but at one time the Irish Times was an avowedly unionist newspaper. It existed to advocate the continuation of British rule in Ireland, and it's not that anymore, not by any means. But I think that like that cultural link, I suppose, has not entirely disappeared, and I think that probably links to a broader thing. There were people being like, "Oh yeah, it's the most left leaning newspaper in Ireland," or someone was saying something about how like, "Oh, it was the left attacking the people who are ideologically closest to them," and like obviously it's not true. Like the Irish Times is a pretty centrist newspaper, and I think, but I also think that the unionist thing is a pretty good example of that. That like like even back in the day when the lines of what was progressive and what was conservative were in different places, that even then the Irish Times was on the conservative side of that debate, right? Like they were advocating for a continuation of the status quo in like the 1920s, and they're advocating for regression or I guess resistance to social progress when it comes to trans rights now. That like it's never been one of the most left wing newspapers in Ireland. It's more left wing than some newspapers. It's better than like it's not the Burkean or whatever. Like they're not far right, but like it's not left wing either. It's not advocating socialist views. It's not even particularly socially progressive. It was kind of on the right side of repeal and marriage equality, but even then it was still platforming. It was still platforming people like Breda O'Brien who were saying horrible things about like gay couples and their ability to parent, or horrible things about people who get abortions. Like it's always been centrist at best, and worse than that at times. Worse than that. I'm revealing my own biases here, but of course I have biases, and that's fair enough.
Not to give too much, what would the word be, attention to just some idiots on Twitter that I've noticed, but it's quite funny. I've seen people arguing against Trinity News's move here by saying things like, you're anti-free speech, or that you're somehow quote unquote censoring one of the most powerful news organizations in the country. And like you've pointed out before, like almost all of this is just pure bad faith. But I see
Yeah.
like a lot of people on social media just like harassing reporters on matters of just sort of they're trying to take some sort of high road stance on things, but they don't actually understand sort of the basic principles of journalism. Like, have you ever noticed that, or
Yeah, I think like look, I think there are genuine issues of free speech in the world today, and I'd like us to talk more about those. But like, yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of people who don't understand the basic tenets of journalism, and I think you're right that a lot of reporters do face a lot of online harassment, which is, I guess, part of a broader problem of online harassment that happens to a broader cohort of society than just journalists. But yeah, I think the reason free speech gets used is because I suppose it's easy. It's easy as a stick to beat people with. That it's like everyone loves free speech, and no one's going to call themselves anti-free speech. So if you can, even partially successfully make it out like your position is the free speech one, then obviously it's sort of rhetorically damaging to the person you're arguing with. And like, yeah, I think for that reason, it's very useful to people, and it's easy to blur the lines, right? Because free speech in the purest sense obviously means like government can't repress you for saying things, and I think we all agree with that, and I think all of us agree with a slightly broader definition as well. Like I think that we probably do worry about like the amount of control that big tech has on like the opinions that get promoted on Facebook and Twitter, even if we think the arguments that Donald Trump is being censored or whatever are bad faith and not necessarily like the sort of social justice issue of the millennium or whatever. But even with a broader definition of free speech, like yeah, you're right, like it's bad faith. It's people arguing that not giving someone money for their opinion is censoring them, and that's obviously very silly. But I think it's because free speech is a thing that we're all in theory in favor of, and it's also because like I suppose it's easy to think of it in very simplistic terms, like free speech, like oh. So, since the speech is in fewer places than it was a moment ago, then the speech must be less free. It's a violation of free speech. Like it's nonsense, but it's a bit of basic rhetorical sleight of hand.
The sort of, if you don't want to pay for my opinion, you're censoring me. I love that. Like, I really wish I could go up to people in like O'Connell Street and say, "Give me a tenner, and I'll tell you what my favorite Pokemon is." And if they don't, you're censoring me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's hilarious when you think about it, even for a second. Yeah.
I am so glad that I have my Twitter on private at the minute. Not that I was really getting much flack in general, but before, just the amount of stuff that does my head in. Like I saw one student publication, they had to issue an apology to someone that threatened to sue them, and it was just a very unpopular person that this was, and people in Twitter under their like apology were calling the journalists like spineless and like pathetic and not doing their job as journalists. And I was just, oh, it was infuriating. And, defamation or how massively a lawsuit would like destroy that student paper.
Yeah.
People from the same university as the paper. Like imagine something like that happening. And, you'd be very disappointed in yourself that you kind of made some sort of slip up like that, endangered your publication. And then to see fellow students just like giving you crap over just a concept that they don't even truly understand. Oh my god, I would hate that so much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I remember, I think the thing you're talking about, but yeah, it's a hard thing, and I think like it's a nuanced situation, right? Because like if it's the thing I'm thinking of, like the reporting seemed to me to be broadly pretty good, and it's important to say these things. But yeah, like you say, like I don't blame the student publication. Ireland's defamation laws are very strict, and it is easy to be done for defamation in situations where you shouldn't, where they are things that you reasonably should be able to say about someone, and it's a problem. It's a genuine, like, and we're talking about threats to free speech. That's a threat to free speech. It's someone threatening you with legal action because of the things that you're saying. And like, yeah, okay, we probably do need defamation laws, maybe. Get into my broader thoughts about the legal and political system another time. But like we all probably agree you shouldn't publish things that are untrue about people. But also the threat of lawsuits shouldn't be able to be used as a method to censor people. And that's what it is, because it's also not just like, it's Ireland's defamation laws are written in such a way that it is possible to lose a defamation lawsuit in circumstances where you shouldn't. But even bigger than that, the mere threat of a lawsuit, even if you might win it, or even if it's arguable, can be enough to force a retraction. I assume that was what happened in this case, and it would happen in a lot of the cases of student papers. And I know of several cases where it's happened in the case of student papers where nothing defamatory was said, but they had to retract it because they didn't have the money to fight that lawsuit. Like, lawyers cost lots of money, and student papers don't have that kind of money. So if you're someone who, for whatever reason, has the money to afford or to seem like you can reasonably threaten to afford a lawyer, in the first instance to send some threatening letters, and then possibly to look like you might be able to follow through with a lawsuit. Yeah, a lot of the time you can get people to back down just over that. You see that kind of thing happening in broader, like much bigger than just student media. Like there was, I can't remember exactly what the subject of the RTE was having a debate, and they cut off someone's microphone because they were calling the DUP, they're calling the DUP homophobic, and like that's objectively true. That by any standard that is true, but the threat of a lawsuit, even for an organization as large and well funded and backed up by the government like RTE, they're so scared of getting sued. Now, like I think RTE was being cowardly there. Like I don't think that was actually a good faith sort of a good faith interpretation of sort of reasonable risk to their organization, but like there's added somewhere under those layers of sort of overcautiousness and cowardice. I think there is also there's a core thing there of you don't want to get sued, and in the case of a student publication, you can't afford to get sued. We don't have the money, and it's also that student publications aren't like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the organizational structure of every single one in Ireland, but I know in the case of Trinity News and the case of University Times, the other Trinity newspaper, we're not incorporated as organizations either. So it's not just that the student publication doesn't have the money to fight the legal battle. It's that actually, if the student publication doesn't have the money to fight the legal battle on your behalf, which they don't, you'd be personally liable as a student journalist. Like you'd be an individual taken to court for the stuff you printed in your student newspaper. So like, we can't ask people to take on that liability, and we shouldn't have to. So no, yeah, it's a real problem. And like you were saying, it's kind of heartbreaking to see people give out to the journalists about that, because I am sure that the journalists didn't want to print that retraction. They didn't want to apologize. I'm sure they probably did stand by the things they had said in the first place, and they're probably just as angry that they had to retract it. And at the same time, I do understand people's frustration, because like it sucks to see powerful moneyed people using their power and their money to silence criticism. So I get why people are angry, but it is misdirected.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, even just to tie back to that RTE thing, I believe it was Joe Brolly, but like
yes,
the fact that he also he wasn't just giving out a statement. I think the DUP is homophobic. He had like quotes from members of the party, and you really hate to see someone being kind of shut down over facts of this is what they've said, and it was just objectively absolute hateful.
Yeah,
it's terrible.
Yeah, no, you're dead right. Yeah, which is why, like, though I think RTE are coming from a place of sort of like justified caution over Ireland defamation laws. They were just completely in the wrong in that case, because yeah, like you say, he had evidence.
And like, as well as the sort of strict like defamation laws, I think sort of the public in general in this country has a very weird relationship with the journalism industry. Like for decades, it was very sort of in the pocket of like the status quo, and you can argue all day long about is that remaining to be true in this day and age. Yeah. But like a significant amount of the country seems to think that like every journalist in Ireland has like a big list of everyone that was at like the Marion Hotel, and they're just refusing to tell people. Like it's
no, you're right. Like we do have a weird culture around journalism in Ireland, and it's born out of being a small country. I think like our country doesn't have enough space to sustain a very big coterie of journalists. So it has been the case in the past that like you could expect, that the journalists will probably be able to find out stuff like, who's at the Marion Hotel gathering, and the fact that they weren't here, it sucks, but people are used to being able to have access to that kind of information. And it is also like, it's true that we just haven't been able to sustain a large number of newspapers. There are only really three like newspapers we could really call sort of national like broadsheet, and I mean this in the like content sense rather than the strict size sense, newspapers in Ireland, the Times, the Independent, and the Examiner. And like the Independent up until quite recently was owned by Dennis O'Brien, and now it's owned by a massive multinational media conglomerate. And the Irish Times owns the Irish Examiner, so those two are owned by the one company, the first and the third by circulation. And then there's RTE, which like for the most part, like I don't buy into most, I guess, conspiracist thinking about RTs, like, like being told by the government to censor critical content or whatever. But like by virtue of being state funded, RT is naturally conservative about criticizing the government. Though I think it does a lot of very good journalism. Just like government owned outlets are always going to be very hampered. So like, and those are the four big outlets. That's what we got. So yeah, no, we have a weird media culture, and it produces weird reactions from the public, but it also makes it hard sometimes to see the kind of journalism that you'd like to see.
Yeah, I agree completely. And yeah, just to kind of circle back to the Irish Times, thing. So obviously you weren't the sole decision maker. It was, it was made by the senior editors and stuff. But as far as I know, you were the first person to sort of bring that decision out to the public via Twitter. So were you worried at all about, sort of speaking out and criticizing such like a big journalistic institution, or did that sort of thought not even cross your mind at all?
I mean, it occurred to me. I don't think at any point it felt like a limiting factor. That again, didn't expect it to become a big thing. I didn't really necessarily want it to become a big thing because kind of like I said earlier, we thought this was just a small thing that we don't necessarily deserve huge amount of accolades for. But it did occur to me. But I'm also like, look, if the Irish Times doesn't make a complete 180 on this thing and sort of disavow what it previously did and say, I think it was actually wrong of us to consistently platform this kind of hatred, then like I don't really want to work there, and like I've been publicly critical of other newspapers. I got a lot of stuff to say about stuff that the Independent has done in the past as well. And again, it's the same thing, that it's like if I feel compelled to give out about a newspaper's publishing really horrible things on Twitter, then unless the newspaper gets to a place where it has stopped doing that and has acknowledged that the things it did in the past were wrong, then I don't ever want a professional relationship with that media outlet, and I'm okay. I'm okay cutting that path off, and like it I guess it protects me against growing up and losing all my principles or something, which I don't think is going to happen, but like who knows? Or like I don't know, or like falling down and hitting my head and forgetting the reasons that I have principled stances against working with those people, that I'm protected by the fact that maybe they're angry at me. I don't know how much notice the Irish Times took of us. But yeah, so yeah, no, not a worry for me personally. And that's also like, I can't speak on behalf of everyone in TN for that. So like, while I really, really don't want this whole thing to be about me, because it's not about me, I am also aware of the fact that like if there are going to be negative reactions from it, if it's going to cause problems for anyone, I would prefer the problems were caused for me. Like I'm happy and eager to absorb that part, at least, because like I don't get to make that decision on behalf of everyone who works for TN. We got a staff of like 50 people, and if they do want to go on and work in these places, I can't necessarily stop them. I wouldn't agree with them. That's necessarily a good idea, but I don't get to make the decision for them. And these things are complicated. So yeah.
Brilliant. That's really sort of good and like principled viewpoint on the situation.
Thank you.
So just to move on slightly and talk more about you. So you graduated in computer and electronic engineering. Does that ever compete with journalism for like your biggest passion?
Not particularly. I'm interested in a lot of things. I did my course. I graduated just there in May. Enjoyed it a lot. But there's also a world in which I would have happily studied, politics or something, or maybe even law. I'm interested in a lot of things, so it's never felt like there's a competition. And the two have positively interacted. In a lot of ways, like currently the vast majority of the freelance work I'm doing is for Silicon Republic, which is this tech news website, for those who don't know, biggest one in Ireland. So like working with them was possible in large part because I have that kind of confluence of expertise that I've got a lot of experience having done student journalism, but I also I know the ins and outs of technical stuff, so I can write on those topics with an understanding of how they sort of work internally, and what the concepts mean and that kind of thing, without necessarily having to go and research and educate myself to gain a foothold in that. So it helped me sometimes, and other times it's like it's not such a big deal, you know. I don't feel like there was a competition for it. I mean, like, I guess in a basic sense, there might have sometimes been some competition when there are probably times I spent in TN meetings that I should have spent in class, or I would have been able to participate in more journalism related things if I had fewer hours of engineering courses or whatever. But that's fine. And you know, I don't know if going back now I would make the same decisions about what college course I was going to study or whatever. But I mean, that doesn't matter. This is I ended up here by whatever means, and I'm very happy with that.
Brilliant. And now I can just take off my little question about the Silicon Republic, because you brilliant. And so, like, did you ever have a stage in your life, like when you were younger, where you realized that you were interested in journalism, or you wanted to follow that road, or was it sort of just a very slow, gradual process?
Yeah, I mean, a bit of both. I was also interested in writing when I was much younger. I was much more into like more creative writing, I suppose. Like when I was in primary school, I participated in a bunch of creative writing competitions and that kind of thing. So I knew from early on that I liked the written word. But then I suppose in my teenage years, I kind of would have pivoted away from that a bit more. Like most of my subjects in secondary school were mostly more focused on maths and physics and that kind of thing. So at that point, I was thinking more about like wanting to do this engineering thing. And at that point, well, I wasn't necessarily sure what I wanted to do with my life. Journalism wouldn't have been something that necessarily occurred to me as being high up. Even though I always had a vague aspiration of like, well, if I could swing it, I'd like to write either as a considered hobby, or maybe even as a career in some sense. So a lot of the transformation into being like, journalism is something I could definitely see myself doing for some role of my life. A lot of that happened in the last couple of years. That like when I was in college, I got slowly involved in Trinity News more and more, but I also was exploring other things. Like I did competitive debating for a couple of years as well, and got a lot out of that. So I guess one of the things that college represented for me was like an opportunity to explore lots of different avenues, and one of them was journalism, and journalism then was like, oh yeah, remember you love writing. And this is, I guess, a kind of writing that you don't necessarily have a huge amount of prior experience in, but I took to really, really, really quickly, and really enjoyed. And here I am, I suppose.
That's actually very similar to my own sort of story. Like that's wow. Even like got down to the sort of debating thing as well. Yeah, I used to be so obsessed with creative writing. Like back whenever I was in primary school, I won some award for writing like a short story about two friends traveling the country during the War of Independence. Wow. And one of them, they're in a pub that catches fire, and one of the friends rescues the other guy, but on accident he saves Michael Collins' life. Plot twist.
Wow.
And then very like I had a sort of similar, not really knowing what I wanted to do. Like I always was interested in just information, learning as much as I could, and having the ability to sort of explain it to other people. And then as I got older, I was getting more interested in sort of current affairs and politics, but never really from the sort of journalistic side of things. And then eventually, whenever I was, 17-ish, and it's kind of, the pressure is starting to come on, I was like, yeah, this journalism thing might be a good idea. And then I went, so I just went from the Michael Collins short stories to here.
It's a path that makes perfect sense to me. I think that's it. I think it's that, like, if you're someone who's interested in writing as a sort of, in general, just putting words to paper, and then you have any kind of related interest in current affairs or politics, that the marriage of those things into being a journalist makes a lot of sense. Which isn't to say that, like, literature isn't also dealing with important issues. I guess what I'm saying is, for me, it made sense as a marriage of my interests.
Your point there about literature just reminded me of, like, I think my first week of college, and meeting a load of people from my course for the very first time, and a girl who's like gone on to become one of my good friends. we're talking about books, and she's like, "Oh, I'm actually reading a book about Brexit at the minute," and I'm like, "Oh, that's very interesting. I think I'm reading Sherlock Holmes," and she's like, "Don't you feel bad about that?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And she's like, "You don't feel bad about not reading about like journalism-y current affairs stuff?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Sherlock Holmes is pretty cool, I think."
Yeah, that's a lot of nonsense. Like, they're both really important. You know, like the way I do it is I alternate. I read one fiction and one nonfiction book. You know, back and forth, or
And
just pick one. If one of them matters to you, go for it.
so, like me, you've been the editor of your paper for a few months now. So, do you have any plans to sort of change Trinity News or to sort of leave your mark on it in the next year in any way?
I mean, some of it is going to be just the sort of pedestrian, like keeping the ship running and making sure we maintain you know, the standard of reporting that I hope that we're known for throughout what continues to be a very weird time for students. Having now worked in both a professional setting and worked in TN, like I do think TN has an excellent journalistic culture. I'm really lucky that that was the place I learned to learn the trade and learn to love it. So some of it's just gonna be that. Like I'm proud just to be part of the legacy. We're also cooking up a couple of new things. I want us to do more investigative content, and we'll see how that works out. Those are the kinds of things I suppose that you can't know, and you certainly can't talk about it. I want us to take more bold editorial stances, but I think we've done that already. I am getting us a TikTok. One of the things that's sort of at the forefront of my mind is, I guess, an understanding of the changing social media landscape. That, like, for a long time, we think of ourselves as an online first newspaper, so we're very proud of our print edition. It's one of the things that takes up the most of our time. But also, like, online is always going to be very important and allows us to respond to things immediately. It's a bigger venue than print. So yeah, we're an online first publication, and we publish things to our website, obviously, but then we would always think of in terms of like funneling people to our websites and sharing stuff from our website, when we post it. We would always have thought of Twitter and Facebook as our sort of our mainstays, which makes sense. They're text-based social networks. You make tweets, you make posts, they have a link to your thing, they have a caption or a subheadline or something, and there you go. It works in a very simple, traditional sense that newspapers understand. But to be totally honest, as far as I can understand, like, I'm 24 years old, so the extent to which I understand is limited. But as you know, as far as I understand, a lot fewer 18-year-olds, people coming into college now, even a little bit older, use those platforms. Like people don't use Facebook as much as they did. People don't use Twitter as much as they did, and that's probably only going to become more true with each passing year. Obviously, I'm only around for a year in my editorship, but yeah, it's a process that's ongoing, and I suppose it has now reached the point where we can definitely no longer ignore it. So one of the biggest things, I suppose, for me, one of the most important things for me, is to think about and to develop ways in which we can engage with new platforms like TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, things that people are using who don't use that much Twitter or Facebook. Like, this presents difficulties for us in a couple of ways. In that, like, first of all, you can't just sort of fire out a post for each article the way you would on Facebook and Twitter. Like, you can't make, I mean, you could in theory, but it would be exhausting. Make an Instagram story or a TikTok for each time you share an article. That would be a very weird format, and also it wouldn't work very well because those aren't text-based platforms. Instagram is very selective in terms of letting you share links. So, you know, that would be very hard if we think of like funneling people to our website as the primary thing that we used to do on Facebook and Twitter. So it's about thinking about, like, how are we going to pivot to those new platforms? Do we need to be creating native content for those platforms? Like, we have had video teams and social media teams for a while now. I actually started out as deputy online editor of Trinity News way back when. So, like, I got my start making Instagram stories for us. We use them to do live coverage of stuff like SU council meetings, SU elections when those happen, that kind of thing. But, like, do we need to? Is more of our content going to be happening there? Is it ever going to be true, that their website isn't the primary place. Like right now, that feels sort of implausible, but I don't know. I can't predict how the future is going to go. So yeah, I guess I don't have answers, but I have a lot of questions about how those platforms are going to fit into what being a newspaper looks like in the current moment and in the future. And also, though, like not just from a publishing perspective, though that's the most important one, but also from a participation perspective. Like we're big on one of the things that I think people think of when they think of Trinity News within the walls of Trinity is that we're a newspaper that it's easy to get involved with. That like if you want to get a start in writing or journalism, that TN's a place you can do it. And one of the ways that we've always managed that is through Facebook groups. That's where a lot of our writing happens. We'll join Facebook groups, and then when we're kind of getting ready to gear up to do another print issue, our editors will go into those Facebook groups and we'll be like, okay, here are some of the things we think, some of the pitches that we think we want to include in the next issue. Would anyone here be interested in writing about any of these, and we can work on it? Or even just being in the Facebook group and being like, by the way, if you're in this group, you'd like to pitch an article to us, like give us a message and that kind of thing. So that doesn't work if first years aren't overwhelmingly on Facebook. Like used to be everyone was on Facebook, and that was how college events and stuff got organized, but they're not anymore. So how do we manage that? And the answer currently is a lot of Google Docs and email mailing lists as well. But maybe that's something we're going to have to innovate about even more. And also, like up until last year, internally TN ran on a series of Facebook group chats, and that was fine. But like we've now stopped doing that. And one of the things I did one of the first things I did as editor was to move us to Slack. And it was partially because they keep stripping features away from Facebook Messenger. I swear to God, it has become steadily less and less functional. But there's also a lot of other benefits. Not everyone has a Facebook account, and they should be required to get one if they want one. Or if you are someone like me who actually uses Facebook as where they do most of their social chatting, then it's nice to be able to separate your TN work from that if you want to. Like if you want to have those two things in different venues, and that's something you should be able to do. Also, Slack's just got a lot of very useful functions to us, and so far it's worked very well. So yeah, new media is I suppose, whether or not I had planned for it, is becoming a big theme.
Brilliant. Yeah, you really summed up the whole sort of situation like quite well. I feel like we all, have questions about, where media is going to go in the future. Like I've even noticed myself, I would maybe like post every maybe fifth article that I do on Facebook, not even for exposure, but just because my family are the only people that notice and care. And they're like, oh, what are you doing with college stuff? Because just where I put things that I want my family, my older family, like uncles and aunts and grandparents and stuff to see. And then, I keep everything else separated. Like, but yeah, just moving on. This is, a bit of a cliched question, but do you have like a dream journalism job out there?
I don't know. I have, I guess, a sense of the kind of journalism I want to do. Like I want to be doing investigative things. I want to be breaking big stories. I want to be covering things as or before anyone else is covering them. I'd like to be at the forefront of current affairs, and ideally big international affairs. I'm very interested in international politics and geopolitics. But I don't necessarily have a clear vision of like there's a certain outlet I'd like to work at, or a certain like editorial position within a certain outlet, or a certain editorial position within any conceivable outlet that I really like. And also, I think that's always changing, right? Like some of the things I'm most excited about are very, very new places. Like stuff like the Dublin Inquirer, I think is one of the most exciting publications in Ireland in terms of the new approach it's taking. The Journal is probably my favorite sort of traditional quote unquote news outlet in terms of that it does traditional news rather than it being traditional itself in Ireland. And obviously that's relatively new as well. One of my favorite international outlets is Bellingcat, which is like only kind of a news outlet anyway. It's something, an open source intelligence community as well. Like it's much fuzzier. So a lot of the things I'm excited about are very new. So by the time I get to my dream journalism job, it might not exist yet. So I don't know. But I also have a lot of respect for legacy, for some of the bigger names in sort of legacy journalism. I have my problems with it, and one of those problems when they published was it Senator Tom Cotton's article about deploying the military to violently put down Black Lives Matter protests. I cancelled my New York Times subscription, and I think there are a lot of problems with it, but it is probably the like newspaper that I have, like, yeah, it's traditional newspaper that I have the most respect for. I liked The Guardian. I hold my political nose and read The Economist and the Financial Times a medium amount. I really like outlets like Foreign Affairs, but they're, I guess, a little bit less newspapery. So I don't know if you could call that journalism. It's more an academic journal almost. So I don't know. To answer your question, I'm not really sure. But I have a sense of the kind of like, I'd like to work in a place that has a strict standard for journalism and good reputation for journalistic excellence, reporting on big important news stories as they happen or breaking them. I'd like it to be morally, I don't know if above reproach is possible, but I'd like to feel good about the place that I work.
Yeah, that is like, you can't really enjoy working somewhere if you feel like you're kind of selling your soul. But that is like a very good way to sort of see things. Like, I feel like a lot of people in the sort of the younger people in like the journalism sort of world, they get too sort of, it's like they have blinders on and they have like an image of, this is the place I want to work and this is the sort of specific job I want to have, and it kind of limits them to other opportunities. And I feel like that's like a massive sort of mistake to make so early on in your career, to just be very set on one thing. And then if you don't get that one job that you're really obsessed with, you know, you're not going to be,
you're gonna be unhappy. No, that makes sense.
And lastly, just to move on to the big question that I ask everybody on the podcast, do you have any advice for like our listeners that you know, are just trying to get their foot in the door of journalism, or just they're trying to succeed in that world?
I guess my two pieces of advice, one was more useful than the other, in an immediate sense, is like get involved in stuff in college. That like whether your campus has a student newspaper and a good one and multiple ones, get involved, write stuff, practice, enjoy it. It's like, there's no better teacher than experience. For a start, it'll be lots of fun is another thing. It'll enrich your college experience is a third thing. But also just like, I do genuinely think there's no better educator. But the second one, and I'm going to call back to the first piece of advice in the second one. The second one is just be as brave as you can. Just try stuff. Apply for things that you might not necessarily get. Reach out to people, whether it's for an opportunity or while trying to write a story and trying to get a source or get a comment. Reach out to people even in cases where you think you're very unlikely to get a positive response. Just try stuff, because I think journalism is mostly about gumption. I think it's mostly about the ability to ask the question, even when it's kind of an awkward question to ask. Sometimes it will work out, and then you'll be the person who did do it. You'll be the person who did get that job, or the person who did manage to break the story with that comment from the important person in it. Like, I didn't think that I would nail down a job as a paid freelance journalist, getting paid to write words, just like a couple of weeks after I finished my non-journalism related degree. But I managed to do that because I applied. Something sounded vaguely like it suited me, and I applied for it, and it worked out. And like similarly, to sort of call back to the first one, like, I was able to do that not just because I had the gumption to apply for something that I guess wouldn't necessarily have occurred to me, even if I did fit the bill, as it turned out relatively well, but I was able to do that because I didn't realize how well student journalism had educated me and trained me. That experience was really invaluable. So practice and gumption are the two things that.
I'm gonna get a tattoo on my chest that says practice and gumption. Or maybe like,
I'd be very flattered.
Or maybe like across my knuckles. Do you want to meet practice, or do you want to meet
all the fist fights, of course, the journalists get into.
But so just to recap for everybody, Jack's great advice: get involved in student journalism as much as you can, try for every opportunity, and make sure you have that gumption. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Jack.
Thanks for having me. It was a real pleasure.
No problem. So everybody, keep an eye out on Twitter for our next episode, which should be relatively soon, but I do say that every time and it's not true every time. And thanks for listening to Rough Draft. Stay tuned.